Welcome! In this video we are going to take a look at Chapter 3, Basic HTML Structure. So this is a pretty big chapter. There's a lot of stuff in here, so I may break this video into two separate videos just so we don't have an hour or two long video. So in this chapter we're going to be starting a web page, creating a title, creating headings. We've done a little bit of that already. Understanding the HTML5 document outline. We're going to take a look at headings, grouping headings, common page construction, creating a header, navigation, article section, aside, footer, so a lot of the main basic structure elements, creating generic containers like divs, improving accessibility, naming elements with a class or ID, and adding the title attribute to elements, and then comments as well. Alright, so let's get rolling here. So we're going to start a new web page. So I'm in brackets. I'm going to do File, New, and again I'm going to do less than sign, exclamation point, and then my doc type, space, HTML in lowercase, and then a greater than sign. And I'm going to do my HTML with a language attribute. And notice that I typed HTML and I typed L and I didn't get my code hinting to come up. And that's because I haven't saved this document yet. So I'm going to do a save as, and I'll put it in the right folder, and let's just say this is 3-2 just for example purposes, and then remember to put your .html on there. And then I'm going to click save. Now my color coding changes and I will get my code hinting, as you can see. Next, I'm going to do my head. And remember, nested inside the head, indented, is a meta tag with a char set UTF-8 attribute. And then, of course, our title. And our title should be descriptive of what the page is. So for this one, I'm just going to create an example page. So let's just say I'm creating a photo album. So I'm going to do Dan Kretz's photo album. Okay, and then after the closing head tag, I'm going to put a blank line in there, and I'm going to create my body tags. So there's my basic structure. Doc type, opening and closing HTML element, opening and closing head element, opening and closing body element, and then inside the head, your meta tag with a character set and your title. Those are going to be on every single web page we build. So I'm going to do a Control S to save that. And then let's come back to our book. So here we look at the code, and that's the exact code I just created, except I did put some title text in there as an example. Okay. So as you go through your step-by-steps, and I would strongly encourage you not just to read the book, but actually type in the code that they have you type in here to get experience, as well as doing it with this video. So the book's going to talk about two sections of a page, the head and the body. So the document head is where we define our title and where we put meta tags that will help us with search engine optimization. We have links to style sheets. We could have embedded style sheets in the head section. There could be JavaScript in the head section. So there could be a lot of things up there in that head section. Right now, all we've learned to do is the meta tag with the character set and the title tag. But be aware, as time goes on, we will be adding more things to that section. And remember that the user doesn't see the content or doesn't see anything that's in the head section except for the title that shows up in the browser title bar or the tab. So the body tag, on the other hand, the body element encloses the page's content, which is text, images, forms, audio, video, any kind of content that the visitor or user sees is inside of that body element. So basically, it's just the body of your page. And I know I've gone through that a couple times now, but it doesn't hurt to review. So you want to make sure you go through all these tips. These tips are excellent for your knowledge. You need to know these things. For example, HTML5's doc type isn't case sensitive. It could be all lowercase, which I've said in previous videos. But from a standards point of view, we should keep it all uppercase. All of your HTML elements will be lowercase. Okay. Some of these other tips about indenting code, but anything that's nested inside of an element generally gets indented. It doesn't change the way the code is rendered in a browser window. Okay. So here's a section on HTML's improved doc type. And I got to tell you, the old doc types, as you can see, were quite long. And boy, what a pain. Try to remember all that stuff. The new doc type is awesome with HTML5. HTML5 is so much easier to learn and write code in than HTML3 and 4 were. It's just awesome. So let's talk a little bit about the title element. So the title element, as it says here, should be short, descriptive, and unique to each page. Okay, so every page has a title, and they're unique because every page is unique, and it should be descriptive about what that page is. Okay, and in most browsers, it's going to show up in the tab or title bar. And search engines definitely use that information. And the other place it shows up is if a user bookmarks or saves your page, whatever the title is will be the title of the bookmark. So it's important when a user sees that information that he or she knows, oh yeah, I know what that page is because the title was created properly. So in short, make your title unique for each page to improve search engine results and make your visitors' experience better. So it helps with accessibility, helps with search engine optimization, which is SEO, and that's really why we want to do it. So again, to create a title, I'm going to go back to my code, type in your opening title tag, then comes your title text, which is the part that's unique. And notice that anytime we type in text in between an opening and closing tag or element, that text is generally formatted. In other words, you can have punctuation, you can have capital letters, you can have spaces, and it will render that way because it's text. It's not an HTML element. The title is the element. The text is what shows up in the browser window. Okay, and there's some more information here about the title when you read the chapter if you haven't done so. So next, let's talk about headings. Headings are extremely important to a web page. HTML provides 6 heading levels, which have been around for quite a long time. They're not new to HTML5. But each heading from H1 to H6 is important, where H1 would be a top level heading, and I explained this in an earlier video. H2 is a subheading of H1, H3 is a subheading of H2, and so on all the way down to H6. Now you're not always going to use H1 through H6 on every page. In fact, most pages you won't. You're always going to have an H1 on every page. It's important for SEO. And most of the time you will probably have an H2 at least, just for document structure. Again, when you think of a web page, you think of how you structure a document with headings and subheadings, and that's how that web page is going to be laid out. It's important for accessibility, it's important for search engine optimization, and it's important for your users to be able to understand what you're trying to present them with. So, how do we do our headings? So let me go back into brackets. In our body section, let's do an H1, so less than H1, and I'm just going to do heading 1. Then I'm going to do an H2, heading 2. You see where I'm going here, so you can see what they all look like. Heading 3. And an H4 for heading 4. And finally, our H5 for heading 5. And the last one will be an H6 for heading 6. I'm going to save this page. And I'm going to go to where I have this page saved, and I'm going to preview it in the browser. So I'm going to double click. So there it is, heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, heading 4, heading 5, heading 6. Now this is just the default rendering for this browser. Most browsers will be very close to this. However, we don't use different headings because of their font size or presentation. The headings are used for document structure. Heading 1 is always the most important heading. It's the main heading. Heading 2 is always a subheading of heading 1, and so on. We're not worried about how they look. We can change the way they look with our CSS, our cascading style sheets, and we will do that later when we learn how to use CSS. But I don't ever want you to say, oh, I'm going to use a heading 2 because it'll be bigger than a heading 3. That's not how we use headings. It's the importance of the document structure that decides which headings we should be using. Okay? So there you have it, heading 1 through heading 6. In our code, that's exactly how we code it. Go back to our book, and the book is going to kind of walk us through, and you can see there's heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, and 4, 5, and 6 as we just talked about. One other resource that I really want to show you that you should get in the habit of using is called the W3 Schools. So the W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium. And the W3 is important because that is the organization that creates the standards for HTML and a number of other things. They decide what is correct, they decide what's standard compliant, and they decide which version of HTML is current. So when HTML6 comes out, the W3 will be the organization that develops the standards for that. The W3 Schools website is awesome. I use it all the time. I use it in class. I use it on my own. If you ever want to know anything about an HTML element, all you have to do is Google it and go to the W3 Schools, and it will show you how it's used. It will have a description. For example, I'm going to do headings HTML5, and HTML headings W3 Schools is my very first link. If I click on that, it takes me to this page, and there's a ton of information. Right? It talks about how headings are important, all the rules, all this stuff. Okay, so that's the one thing. The other nice thing is you can try it yourself. So you can click on try it yourself, and you can actually change the code over here, and then click on run, and you can mess around with their code. So if I just type in "this is cool" and I click run, there it is. Okay, or if I change this to a heading 1 and run it, it creates as a heading 1. So it's a great website, and you can see there's a ton of stuff here. I mean, this is everything you want to know about HTML and more. So that's the W3 School. So I'd like to see you get in the habit of using that as well as your book. Okay, so let's look at some of the tips here. Your H1 through H6 headings are especially important because of their impact on defining your page's outline. By default, browsers display headings progressively smaller, moving from H1 to H6. But don't forget to choose your heading levels solely based on what hierarchy is important for your content, not on how big or small you want the text to appear, because we can change that with CSS. This makes your page stronger semantically, which in turn improves both SEO and accessibility. It's extremely important. And then it goes on to say that we can style headings later with CSS. Search engines weigh your headings heavily, particularly the likes of H1, which is not to say load your page up with H1s. Search engines are wise to that. Screen readers use H headings to navigate a page by headings via the keyboard. So if somebody's using a screen reader and they just want the headings to be read to get an overview of what the page is like, that's important that you structure the page properly. Use heading levels consistently throughout your site. Okay, don't just don't use H1, H2, H3 on one page and then all H1s on another page, and then keep it consistent. So understanding the HTML5's document outline. So in the previous section we learned about 8 headings, H1 through H6. And while we're on this subject, don't confuse head, the head section, head is an element, with heading or header. Header is an element as well that we're going to talk about, and heading are the H1 through H6s, 3 different things. So it talks about section in here. So before you continue, use section as a generic term to mean distinct part of a page as opposed to the section element, which specifically talks about an HTML element. Like when I say head section, I don't mean the section element, I mean the section that is defined as head. Just so you know that. So in versions of HTML prior to HTML5, the H1 through H6 heading elements were all we had to structure outline. That was it. We didn't have anything else. We had divs, but those are generic containers. There was no semantic structure there. HTML5 came up with 4 content elements designed to add structure to a page. The article, aside, nav, and section. Okay. Plus we have the header and footer that this defines scope. So what this means is each sectioning element has its own H1 through H6 hierarchy, which is completely different than before. Before they said, don't use more than one H1 on a page. Now we can do that as long as the structure is proper and we don't overuse them. Okay, so for example, let's take a look at some code here. So we've got, let me just take this code and let me see if I can put it in brackets. Let me save this. And I'm just going to call this test.html. Okay, so that didn't really come out the way I had hoped, but let's just look at it here. So we've got, here's our body, here's an H1, right? Product user guide. Then we have a section. So a section is a new HTML element that you're going to learn about, and we'll talk about that in a second. Inside the section we have another H1 because structurally this is a new structure. So this is the H1 for the page. This is the H1 for this section. Then we have another H1 for another section because we created a new section. And in fact, we can nest sections within sections, which is what we've done here. So you can see that we'll have our own heading structure for each section of the document, not the section element. It could be an article, it could be a section, it could be an aside. It could be any of those that we talked about. Typically, you wouldn't see it in the nav, but it could be. Okay? And this compares, when you go through and read the chapter, it compares these two sections or snippets of code. So let's go through it. So here's how this is interpreted. The highest level of the outline is product user guide. Well, if we go back to this code, it is. Here is the H1 for the entire page. This H1 is not inside of any element except for the body element. It's not in a section. So this H1 is the H1 for the entire page. Okay, so that is the main heading for the page. Setting it up is a subheading of product user guide, as is basic features and advanced features. So if we look at the structure, it makes sense. Okay, setting it up is a subheading of the page because it's in a section. So the section is more broken down than the page overall. Basic features is another, and advanced features is another. Okay? So you can see how that kind of renders itself. Hopefully it makes sense. After you read the chapter, if you haven't done that, I'm sure it will make sense. And then here's another example using the article element. So the article is different than the section. Article typically is standalone content. So we have article, then we have section, another section, and a closing article. So it's a little bit different way to code it. So there are many ways to code HTML, but we're going to teach you what semantically is correct from a document structure standpoint. That's how I want you to think. How does this make sense from a structure standpoint? We can code it to look however we want it to look, but the document structure is so important because of accessibility and search engine optimization. Okay? So I'm just kind of going down through. The book also talks about grouping headings. Sometimes a heading has multiple consecutive levels. such as with a headline, subheadings, alternative titles, or taglines. So the book goes through and teaches you how to do H groups with just grouping headings together. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I think there's more important things to be doing at this point, but I do want you to read that and learn how to do it because you might see it out there. Okay, so let's talk about common page constructs. In other words, what's the best way to create your pages? And you've no doubt looked at tons of different sites, and you've looked at websites with different layouts and different navigation and different structure. And there are many good ways to do that. But semantically, the semantics that apply to the common page constructs are pretty similar no matter the layout. Okay, so we can take this page that you see here in purple, and much of that is done with CSS. What we're talking about is the HTML construct. The HTML construct is going to be similar no matter how we make it look with CSS, right? I can change this layout to look completely different with CSS, but the HTML code would be virtually the same, okay? So let's talk about this. The first element we're going to talk about is the header element. So if a section of your page has a group of introductory or navigational content, we usually use the header element, okay? So think about that. Introductory content. What type of content would be introductory? Well, logos, a header banner across the top, contact information across the top could be in there, and then navigational content, sets of links, right? The nav element, which we'll get to in a little bit. So how do we code the header element? So let's go to our code, and I don't want this one. Actually, this one did not turn out the way I'd hoped. So here I have all of these headings. I'm going to get rid of these. I'm going to keep just the H1. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in, and actually let me do this above my H1. So here's my header. Okay, so I've got a header, and what I want to do is I just want to have an image in there. So I know you don't know the image tag or any of that yet, but I'm just going to code it. I just need to move some images over real quick here. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it there, and I don't have anything in there. So hold on 1 second here. Earlier I downloaded a bunch of images, and I think they're in here. Okay. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to code in my image, and I'm going to do an alt attribute. And I know I'm coding some things that you won't understand, but that's okay. So here I have a header element, right? And I put an image in my header. And what I'm going to do is I'm also going to put some links in. So in order to do that, I'm going to do this. So let me save this. So right now in my header, this is the page I had open. Missing my beach photo. Let's see here. Okay. So what I want to do, so that's not showing up, so I need to figure out why that's not showing up. Right, so hold on 1 second here. Okay, so my header, I'm sorry, shows up with my image, and then my heading 1 is below that. So that's what we've got. There's our header, there's our image. Okay, now inside the header we can also put navigation. So what I can do is I can have a nav element, and inside the nav element, and again, I know that you don't understand a lot of this code that I'm writing right now, but you will. I can do a unordered list, and inside of that I'm going to do LIs with my links. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this and change so I don't have to retype all that. And these are websites just off the top of my head, they don't mean anything. So now I've got my header element, an image, a nav element, and my links inside my nav element. So I'm going to save this, and let's take a look at it in the browser. Okay, and there are my links. And right now they have bulleted. They can see they're bulleted because I used an unordered list. That's okay. I would change the way that would look with CSS. I could have also done this. And instead of using a list, I could just have two sets of links. If I save this, you're going to notice it's completely different. Now they're next to one another. Okay? Because remember, in HTML code, just because these two lines of code are on separate lines, that doesn't mean anything to the code. It doesn't mean anything to the browser that's rendering the code. These are looked at as one line. Blank lines, returns, that doesn't mean anything in the code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a special character in there and save it. And no worries, we're going to go through all of this later. So now you can see my links are here, and if I click on them, they're going to work. This takes me to ESPN. And if I go back and click on CNN, it'll take me to CNN. So my links work. I've got my header all created. Okay, and then below my header, I've got my H1. I could have put my H1 around my image up here and done it that way too, but we'll get into that as we go along. So that's how you create a header. And again, remember, the header content is generally introductory or navigational. Those are the two types of things that go up in the header, and it's usually found at the top of the page. It doesn't always have to be. Like, you can have a header inside of an article, and that's acceptable as long as the rest of the document structure follows that. But typically you have a header towards the top of the page, and that's usually about it. Okay, so here the book's going to walk you through to create a header, which I just did. And you can look here, very similar code to what I did. So they put their H1 inside the header, and they have a nav with a UL just like I did. So I had my H1 outside the header. I could have easily done this. And if we save this page, it'll look a little bit different like that. And that's kind of how the book did theirs, but you know, there's a million different ways to do these, not necessarily right or wrong. The document structure is what needs to be right. So there's a bunch of tips here. Don't use the header unnecessarily. If all you have is an H1 or H6, H1 through an H6 or an H group and no companion content that would dictate using a header, then don't use it. A header is not interchangeable with a heading, as I talked about earlier in this video. You may not nest a footer element or another header inside of a header. Okay, so you can't nest those things inside the header. A header does not always have to contain a nav element. All right, not necessarily, not all pages have nav elements up towards the top like that inside the header. So next is marking navigation. So in earlier versions of HTML, we didn't have an element that explicitly represented a section of navigational links. Okay, so this is a group of links. This is not a rogue link like a single link or two links to something else. This is your navigation for your site, a group of links that goes to all your pages. Okay, so links in a nav may point to content within the page, to other pages or resources, or both. So whatever the case may be, we're going to use the nav only for your document's most important group of links, not all of them. So you're going to have a set of navigational links that are the most important to your site. Those are the main links that go to all your pages. That's what we're going to use the nav element for. We're not going to wrap a nav element around all of our, every time we use a link. All right. So here in the code, you can see inside the header, there's a nav. They're using the role attribute, and we'll get to roles later. But basically, what the role attribute does is it helps with accessibility. It defines what the role of that element is, and there are several, like 5 or 6 different roles that we will use. All right. Then they have a UL, which is an unordered list, which is just a list with no order to it. And then an LI, which is a list item inside the UL, and then the links. Okay, and I'm going to teach you how to create these. Don't worry. So to designate a group of links as important navigation, we're going to use the nav element, like I did in the code. So when we look at that, here's our nav element, and typically, you know, this isn't. I just did these for examples. This isn't like a, you're probably thinking, well, that's not a main set of navigation. I know. I just did it as an example. Usually these would be links to pages within your own site. They wouldn't be external links like this, unless it was a page that just, that's all it had on it. Okay, so I'm just going to create another one here. If I can type. I'm going to create a link to Google. Okay, and I'll save it. And then our page is going to look like that. And you can see the Google link was added, and if I click it, it takes me to Google. So, some tips. If you have some experience with HTML, you're probably accustomed to just structuring your links in a UL or OL element without the nav element. But if it's a main set of navigational links, we want to use the nav element. And you can kind of read through some of these other links. And here's a deeper look at the nav element, and you can kind of go through and read that on your own. So I'm going to pause the video here. Actually, I'm going to stop the video here, and in the next video we'll continue with chapter 3, creating an article and so on. Welcome. This video will be the second half of chapter 3. So let's get going. In the last video we ended with talking about the nav element. So in this video we're going to start with article. So article is a new element in HTML5, and basically it contains content that could be standalone. In other words, it's not necessarily tied to the web page itself. We could take this content and we could put it somewhere else and it would make sense. And the way the book defines it, the article element represents a self-contained composition in a document, page, application, or site, and is in principle independently distributable or reusable in syndication. This could be a forum post, a magazine or newspaper article, a blog entry, a user-submitted comment, an interactive widget or gadget, or any other independent item of content. So other article examples could be a movie or music review, a case study, a product description, a whole bunch of things. Basically, if you think you could take this information and put it off by itself or put it in syndication, which means publish somewhere else, then it should be in the article element. Okay? So the article is a two-sided element with an opening and closing. And basically, the way the code is here, you can see there's the opening article. They have an H1 inside the article, so that's not the same as having an H1 for the page. This is inside the article element. Then they have a paragraph, a couple paragraphs. Then they have a subheading, an H2, and some image and paragraphs and other stuff. And that's an article. So if we took this information, this text, and we put it off somewhere else on a different website or in a magazine or whatever, it should make sense. So when we look at this, it says Gaudi's non-conformity, already visible in his teenage years, coupled with his quiet but firm devotion to the church, made a unique foundation for his thoughts and ideas. His search for simplicity, based on his careful observations of nature, are quite apparent in his work. And so when you read that, you absolutely could take that information and put it somewhere else and it would make sense. It's not tied to the website. It's not something that you have to have the website for this to make sense. Okay, so that's why it's in an article. So let's take a look. To create an article. So let me go into my code. So after my header, I'm going to put a blank line and I'm going to do my article tag. And that's how we create an article. And then inside my article, I can do an H1. And let's cameras. I'm going to do an H1 for cameras. And then I'm going to have a paragraph. And my paragraph text is just going to be the Canon 80D. And actually, let's do it this way. And I'm just making this up as I go, so bear with me. So I just made up a paragraph, right? And then what I would do down below that, I would have maybe an H2 where I would do, actually, let me do this. trying to just keep this slimlined as much as I can. And then below that I would have a paragraph, and I would just have some text about this camera. I'm not going to type all this in and try to make it up on my head, but and then I would probably have an image. So the text would be about the Canon 80D DSLR camera, which could stand alone on its own. It could be put in a magazine. It doesn't matter where it would be. It would make sense. So that's why it would be in the article element. All right. So that's the article. And there's a whole bunch of tips here, because one big challenge is going to be deciding when to use article versus when to use section. And those two are fairly closely related. They're both container elements. The big thing is, if the content can be standalone, can be syndicated, you use article. That's it. That's all you have to remember. If it can't, then you use section. And you can read through some of these tips. For example, page may contain several article elements, or none at all. There might not be any articles. There could be 3, there could be 5. It just depends on how the page is structured. The article and section elements are easily confused with one another, which is why I quoted directly from HTML definitions. I didn't want you learning them through a filter. I discuss section and choosing between the two in defining a section. So when we get to that in a few minutes, you'll see. And here's some more article examples. The diversity of Papua New Guinea. And then it goes on to talk about it. That's information that could stand alone for sure. And so the book walks you through and gives you a bunch of different article examples, hopefully helping. So the next thing we're going to look at is the section. So the article element has a less semantically specific cousin, which is the section. So section is less semantic than the article. Article is very semantic. We use it when the content can be syndicated. Section is a little less, it's less semantic and more vague. So the section element represents a generic section of a document or application. A section in this context is a thematic grouping of content, typically with a heading. Examples of sections would be chapters, the various tabbed pages in a tabbed dialog box, or the numbered sections of a thesis. A website's homepage could be split into sections for an introduction, news items, and contact information. When you think about it, chapters are not standalone content. They're tied to a book or more chapters. So that would go into a section versus an article is standalone content that could be syndicated. The article and section elements are pretty similar. If you aren't quite sure how to determine the two, see the sidebar, how do you decide? So when we look at section is very similar, and here they've nested a section inside of an article, which we can do, and it makes sense because all we're using the section for inside the article is a container. Okay, this whole piece of content here, all the way down to the closing article tag, can be standalone because it's in the article tag, whereas the section inside the article is just generic, and that's fine to use it that way. So here's a whole section on how to decide which one's which, and I'll let you kind of read that on your own. But basically what it's going to tell you is if the content can be standalone syndicated, you use article, and if not, you use section. Okay, so let's go to our code, and let me go ahead and create a section. And I think I will just do a section independent from the article. So I'm just going to do section. And then inside the section, we could definitely have a heading or a header. I'll do an H2. And then I would have paragraphs and other stuff inside the section as well. Again, I'm not going to type all this stuff out, but I'm just going to put content. And that's it. And that's all there is to creating that section. So another semantically important HTML5 addition was the aside element. The aside element is used when, let me get down here. It's common to think of the aside as a sidebar, but you can place an aside element in a lot of different places. It doesn't have to just be a sidebar. It may be a box within the main content itself. It could be styled any which way. A lot of times you do see it as a sidebar, but without CSS, it's just another container. But we will get to that later on when we do our CSS. So here you see that this page is styled with CSS. This is the aside, right? It's right over here. That's the aside element, and it's basically content that is aside of what it's part of. So when we go down, examples of aside include a pull quote, a sidebar, a box of links related to articles on a news site, advertising, groups of navigational elements like a blog roll, a Twitter feed, a list of related products on a commerce site. There's a bunch of different reasons you use it, and we'll give you more as we go along. But basically, the aside tag is just like the others. There's an opening and a closing. So if I wanted to put an aside for my Canon 80D down here after my paragraph, I would just do aside, and then inside my aside I would do, in this example I'm going to give you, just some links to the Canon website. And then I would do other links too, and then I would have that aside styled so it shows up as a sidebar next to my Canon 80D text. And here's a bunch of tips. Although one way aside is used to mark up content in a sidebar, the aside element itself doesn't affect the layout of the page. The CSS affects the layout of the page. Okay, it's important to remember that. When we do an aside, like if this page wasn't styled with CSS, the aside would just be underneath one of these other sections. HTML5 disallows nesting an aside inside of an address element. And you can go on and read some of these other tips. And then they give some more examples, which is great if you want to read through those. And the next thing we're going to take a look at is the footer. So the footer, when you think of a footer, you probably think of a page footer. HTML5's footer element is appropriate for that, but like header, you can use it elsewhere. So, for example, you can have a section or an article with a header and a footer. It doesn't have to be just page level, it can be element level too. The footer element represents a footer for the nearest article, aside, block quote, body, details, field set, figure, nav, section, or TD element, which is nested. Okay, so a lot of times, and the way I'm going to use it is a footer for my page, which is inside the body element, but you could use it in the article element as well, or the section, which is fairly common. Typically, the content you see in a footer represents things like an appendix, index, license agreement, copyright, sometimes navigation. It just depends on what the developer decided to put in there. So down here, after my section, I'm going to create a footer. And in my footer, I'm just going to see if I can borrow some code here since I don't feel like typing it. Get back where I was. Okay, and then my closing paragraph. I'm going to save that, and let's take a look at it in our browser. And here it is, down here, my copyright symbol, copyright 2011. That's my footer. And you can see there's my section, there's my article, and there's my aside and my H1 up at the top there. So what I did was I just created a footer, a paragraph. I used the small element, and I used this at and copy semicolon is a special character code for the copyright symbol. Then the word copyright 2011. Then I close the small element, close the paragraph element, and then close my footer element. And that's one example of creating a footer, and there's a bunch of tips in here too that you need to read. A footer typically includes information about its section, such as links to related documents, copyright information, its author, and similar items. A footer doesn't need to be at the end of its containing element, though it usually is, and it's invalid to nest a header or another footer within a footer, so you can't do that. And there's some more examples here. Copyright information. They actually put some hyperlinks in their footer. A lot of times you'll see navigation down in the footer, just so users that scroll down, if they're scrolling on a page, they don't have to scroll all the way back to the top to get to the navigation. There's some more examples. And then one of the last things we're going to do in this chapter is the generic container. So a generic container is a div element, and this is not new in HTML5. In fact, this was the only container we had back in HTML3 and 4. The container, the div container is an element that's completely generic, and basically things that don't fit in anything else, you're going to use a generic container. It has no semantic meaning. Typically we assign IDs or classes to the div so that we can style the page. And a lot of times a div is used to contain the entire page, as they show you here in this example in this code. And that's exactly what I do, and that's exactly what I'm going to do in my example for you guys in the code. The reason we do this, you can see the opening div is right after the body tag, and the closing div is right before the closing body tag. That creates a container for the whole page, and now what I can do with that container is I can set width to it, I can assign background colors to it, I can really style it to make it look cool. And that's why we do that. So that's what I'm going to do up here. Right after my body tag, I'm going to do a div, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign it an ID. So an ID is an attribute. So the syntax is, and we're going to go over this more later with IDs and classes, but ID equals, and then in quotes, the name of the ID. And a name that's very common for using divs in this purpose is wrapper, because it's wrapping the page in a div. So I'm going to take out my closing div and go all the way down to the bottom after my footer, and I'm going to put that closing div in there. And I'm going to save my page. Now when I look at this page, I won't see anything different, because you can't see, a div is just a container. You can't see it in the browser unless we style it with a background color or a border or something like that. And that's exactly what they did here. And there are other uses for divs as well. It's just remember that it's a generic container. And the book goes through some reasons for using divs, and you can go ahead and read that. But and there's some history about the div, and you should read that because every site that you're going to work on is going to have div containers. I guarantee you. When we develop websites for mobile, a lot of times we use div containers to do that so that we can create rows and columns. So you're going to run across divs, so you really need to understand when to use a div and when not to use a div. And they give some more examples here. The last part of this chapter is improving accessibility, and I will let you go ahead and read that. And it talks about these roles. And roles are important for accessibility. And basically you can assign any element a role. Okay, and it goes through and talks about different roles and what they are, and we'll talk more about this when we actually do this in code. But there's a banner role, a region that contains mostly site-oriented content rather than page-specific content. There's a navigation role, and this mirrors the nav element. There's a main role for the main content in your document. There's a complementary role, which is supporting content. And there's a content info role, which examples of that would be copyrights and things of that nature, typically found in the footer. But make sure you go ahead and read through that. And then next is naming elements with a class or an ID. So there's two things with this. Classes and IDs are different, obviously. When we assign a class or an ID to an element, it's the main purpose for doing that is so that we can style it with CSS. And an ID is a little bit different than a class. Classes can be used over and over again on a page, where an ID is a unique ID. You can only use it once, and they're case sensitive. The book recommends using classes most of the time. And the simple reason is that you can use them over again instead of just once. So I gave you an example of an ID up here, wrapper. Well, I know that I'm not going to, that's the only time I'm using wrapper on this page, so that's why I gave it an ID. If I wanted to style this particular header with something special, I can assign it a class. So I can do class equals, and then the class name, all lowercase, no spaces, usually is something that makes sense to the developer as to why you're assigning this class to begin with. For example, you could do row or column, or you don't want to do things like red or blue, or if you're creating a class to change a word's color. So here I've got a header, and I'm going to style this, and I'm going to call it border, because this class is going to assign a border to my my header. So just like the ID, it's class is an attribute, and it's right inside the element, whatever element you want to give it. So here div ID equals wrapper, and here header class equals border. These names, the ID name and the class name, are something that you just come up with. There's no rhyme or reason why they're named what they're. I just made these names up. Okay. The ID is unique. You cannot reuse it on this page. This border class I can reuse over and over and over again. So, some of the tips in here. Each ID in an HTML document must be unique. In other words, no two elements in the same page can be named with the same ID, and each element may have only one ID. The same ID can appear on multiple pages and doesn't have to be assigned to the same element each time, though it is customary to do so. Conversely, a particular class name can be assigned to any number of elements in a page, and an element may have more than one class. So that's why the book recommends using classes versus IDs. And you can see here some examples. Div ID equals container. Here they have an ID of table of contents, TOC. Here this class, this article has been assigned a class. Class equals architect. And they gave it a role. Role is main. So you can kind of go through here and get the gist of what we're dealing with as far as classes and IDs. And I'm probably going to make a separate video for classes and IDs when I do the CSS. So let's talk about comments. Comments are really important in your code, and if you've taken any other coding classes, you know that it's important to comment your code. So other people, other developers, when they look at your code, know exactly what you were thinking when you created it. And a comment in HTML5 is less than, exclamation point, dash dash, whatever the comment is, and to close it, dash dash, greater than. So if I was to put this in my code, I could come up here right before my div, and you can see, let me change this. You can see that comments are grayed out. They won't appear in the browser window. They're for the developers, the people that look at the code, and that's it. Another purpose for comments, sometimes you're having an error on your page somewhere and you can't figure out why. You can use a comment to comment out sections of code so you can see if you're still getting the error. For example, if I'm getting an error somewhere around my article tag, I could put a comment up here and a comment down here and comment out this whole section of code to see if I'm still getting the error, to see if this section of code is what was causing my error to begin with. So that's another purpose of comment. You will be adding comments to your pages just for good coding practices, and there's a ton of tips here that you can read so that you understand comments better, but we'll be using them, and I will have them inside your assignments each week. Okay, that was a lot of information, 2 full videos on Chapter 3. That's the last video, and if you have any questions, email me, kretz@fvtc.edu. Thank you.